Okay, we're still up to the thing with the shoes. Been working through the kavanas of putting on your shoes, which are, of course, also the kavanas of the bracha, shosli kol tzarki. We've discussed how shosli kol tzarki has 2 or 3 different meanings. We can understand it as meaning have everything up to the shoes. So have everything. It's the abundance of having everything, even shoes, which are maybe sort of a luxury if it's not the most important thing. That's one way of reading it. Second way of reading it would be the opposite way, which are have everything is a way of talking about shoes, just like Al Tzarki, as we've quoted Mama Chazal that said, person should sell everything he has and buy shoes. In other words, reading that shoes is very important. You can't really go out of your house if you don't have shoes or you're going to hurt yourself. So it seems to be very important to have shoes. And we've discussed how that's mostly so you don't hurt yourself, which got us into a whole discussion. Pikabula about how everything needs protection. And we call this chashmal, which is protection of Imrullah that protects the zone and so on. There's something similar to that which happens to us when we enter the zone, something like a sikha, which is Imrullah protecting the zone. Very lot of different images for this kind of thing. So that was the second chat in Mashasli Kotsarki. Now we're up to a third chat, which we've also discussed, a third reading in the Pshat of Shasli Kotsarki, which it's really not only about the shoes, that since shoes are what you wear when you're standing at the door, you're going out, that's why it's like the last bracha and that seder, where you're getting dressed and then you're going out, so that's when you do Shasli Kotsarki. In other words, there's a movement or an action of going out of your house. In your house, you're protected, but when you go out, you need to have shoes to be protected, but it's more than the protection that the shoes are giving you, at the preparation of Shasli Kotsarki. In other words, everything I'm going to do today, I'm going to work, I'm going to take care of what I need to work, do it's going to be Bracha and God providing you all of that. Now, in the Kabbalah reading, as we've seen, there's all of these readings. We could talk about the Moichin that have to do with the shoes, which is really this Chashmal, so it's going to be connected, but we learned that he understands the Chashmal to just be another instance or the last level of Imma, which goes into Zoh, is that Chashmal, so it's related to that. The second one we discussed at length, how this is a protection and why this is exactly the place that needs protection, because there's Chitzanim after the lowest level, Natzilis, which is the Nuk or the Pnimi of the Nuk, they have the Chitzanim, and therefore we need to create a barrier in between them. And we discussed a little bit of how this barrier might work. The third thing that we've learned about Shasli Kotsarki is how it means the provision of everything by going out of your house and where you're going to work to provide to everything. And we've quoted the Ramak in the Moshe, which is here, which explains this through the language of Shasli Kotsarki, since we have this whole concept, which we never described, we're never taught to learn this concept in depth. Really, all of these things are just making me think that I need to go back and learn all of the basic structures, the basic Yesodus of Darizal. We're just doing Kavanas, but I do think that this is a direction to go in, since we have the heter and the power, the Siyata Deshmaya of doing things in a way of halach lamas in a practical way, which is really what everything is for. There's a big difference between trying to understand things as an abstract philosophy and trying to understand them when they're still the abstract philosophy or abstract, I don't think philosophy is the right word, abstract Kabbalah, how the Olamas work. But they are in the context of how am I going to be mechavan this when I put on my shoes. That changes the attitude to what we're doing. That's why, although we're going slightly backwards, I'm thinking maybe to do some kind of series that will go in the more direct way, at least to have some basic concepts. But I feel like it's It's actually a better way to get into understanding, because the practice is what actually shows us the things, actually shows us the truth of the ideas or the levels, the things that we're trying to get at. So the Ramak read Asli Kalsarki related to the very basic idea that we learned from the Ramak, mostly learned it from the Kenazar, and Shahadis, there's a Shah called Sharabia, where he discusses the sources from this and what it means, which is that there's four different levels of creation, four different kinds of creation, right? And the Kabbalah connected that to four different Shemot Nirdafim, right? There's different synonyms, synonyms that mean the same thing. So at least the three we'll talk about, Priya, Yetzira, Asira, seem to mean the same thing, just different Hebrew words for creation. Bara means creation, Yatzar means creation, Asa means made, so can be made to mean creation. Of course, there's Atzilut, which is not entirely that, so that's why it's somewhat different, but at least we talk about these three words. Gabal Madramak and that shar explains how the match, how the meaning gets to that. We'll get to that. We'll go through that better. But there's what this does is that every time we see a word like Shasa or Sheyatzar or Shebara, we start thinking of these different levels, like we discussed in the Brach of Asheyotzar, which has Asheyotzar, Ubarabai, and then Maflilasa. So it seems to be mentioning these three worlds, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya. Of course, Atzilus is the Neshama itself, or as we discussed it over there. Now, in a similar fashion, he reads if we say She'asa Likal Tzarki, so it doesn't say She'yotzar Likal Tzarki, it doesn't say She'bar Likal Tzarki, it's She'asa. So this must signify on the Shefa and the Ur getting to Olam HaAsiya. And the way he explained it, and he connected it to the concept of shoes, is to explain what does it mean, why would this be Olam HaAsiya, and how does this work? So two things. Number one, these Kol Tzarki, what you need is Olam HaAsiya, and that's why it corresponds to the shoes, which is sort of the lowest level, the lowest thing that you have going down. So if we consider the Shechina, we'll get to explain how this works. If we consider the Shechina, the Al-Matzilis going down to give Shefa to this world, that would be considered her shoes, and therefore when she goes to Olam HaAsiya, that's when she gives you shoes, that's just Kol Tzarki. But there's another very important point that the Ramak made there, which is that didn't start there. And he reads, right? So in other words, nothing really starts in Olam HaAsiya. Of course, when he says Shasli Kal Tzarki, what we really mean is that he brought it down from Olam HaAsiya through Bria Yetzira until Olam HaAsiya. Now, once we get thinking of this, so this, now we're going to get back to the Arizal's language. This makes us think of what it actually means or how this might work, this bringing down of Olam things from Olam Atzilas through Olam Abriya, through Olam Yetzira, through Olam Hayasiya, and how this actually works. So the Arizal again is referencing things that he already discussed when he discussed the elements, how they work, and we're going to try to at least a little bit reverse engineer it from here, or as much as it's relevant to us. And Arizal said like this. In other words, we've learned that Nal is the Chashmal. And really what he means to say here is that he's continuing off that. We're continuing off the idea of the Chashmal being Imma that surrounds the Zon. And he said it surrounds it from the side, which is called Levishim, and it surrounds it on the bottom, under them. Then it would be called shoes. So it's really the same idea, the same existence, the same thing, that just in its different attributes and its different parts would get different names. But here he really wants, I think, the way there's some controversy about this. But it seems like over here he wants to get into what aspect actually would be this now. So as it's distinct from just being a levush or just a protection, and what it does besides for being a protection. So again, we can talk about the protection, but now we have to talk about the third thing, and just like Tzalik, where it's also being mishtalshel and going down through the Olam Atzilas until Olam HaAsiya and giving you something over there. So the Rizal says like this: Anal hazeh kini b'chinas hamesech shenizbar atzlene shemafsek ben Olam Atzilas ben Olam Abriya. So now we have this very big question. And again, a more general question, which is how actually did worlds get separated? So we talk about four worlds, and the Ramak right away in the beginning of his Shar Arabiya and Pardes asks, so does that mean that there's really 40 spheres? We all learned that there's only 10 spheres. How could there be 40 spheres? Or another way really of asking the question is what causes one? We know there's different levels. So we could talk about them as different levels of causality. If one causes the other, that becomes another level. We could talk also of levels of revelation, right? In Chachma, for example, the Ein Sof is more open, it's more revealed. We can feel it, we can see it openly. That's why it's considered Chachma. It's considered a higher level. Once you go down, it's considered low level. There's less Ein Sof, and that is explained this in the beginning of Yitzchok, the concept of Tzimtzum, and all of that. But what's the difference? What kind of qualitative difference must there be between two different worlds? So if there's just one more level, let's say we talk about Olam Atzilas bring 10 spheres of Atzilas and then 10 spheres of Olam Abriya, which are the next 10 levels. That would be the simplistic way of reading it. It doesn't seem to be clear why we would make a cutoff after Olam Atzilas. Why don't we just say, okay, so there's 20 spheres in Olam Atzilas, or of course, just like every other sphere, they each go down. They're going down. This is levels on the ladder stepping down, so we could call it stepping down. But why is it called another world? What's the difference between these two worlds? Why are they two different worlds? Worlds sort of seem to signify some, we could call it like a jump, right? There's a difference. There's some bigger difference between the entirety of El Mabri and the entirety of El Matzilas than there would be just between two levels. So if we say, okay, so it's a little further, so suddenly got a new name, that doesn't seem to be enough for these people. And especially as the Ramak notices, that would basically tell us that there are 40 spheres, and it seems to be incorrect since we've learned that there's only 10 spheres. Now the Ramak had an answer, and we're going to get to what he really discussed over here. But first, we have to answer the first question, which is really what causes these elements to be a different element. Maybe the Ramak says it, the Rizal is more clear about this. Now Rizal says, and he goes on about this at length in Etz Chaim and Sham and Bez. And the Rizal basically says that there's a difference between just becoming further and further from something. Like we say, Chachma is different than Bina, and Bina is different from Das, and Da and Za, and so on. And being entirely closed off and getting it through what he calls a mechitza, a masach. Masach like le masach pesach, like a pareches or a mechitza. And then he'll explain that even that, there's of course even the Matzilis gets things through a mechitza, through a masach. Like we talk about the Za getting things through Imma. So the Imma herself would be a Masach. And we'll see here that maybe this Masach is also Imma. So we're getting it through Imma. So it's also through a Masach. But the way he says it is, Bracha, I'm recording a class. Let me do it. And the Rizal asked this question. And he says in Etz Chaim, in Sham and Bez, that there's differences. And this is his image at least, which is the two different kind of differences. We could talk about a entirely closed masach, which means you're going to get everything. Well, sometimes we, after Chabad and the Maggid, goal is getting something entirely in translation, right? So you can get the entire thought in some sense, but it's not the original body of thought at all, because it's translated, and translation can have different levels, of course. We talk about just changing in different language, and if it could be accurate, the translation into a different language. But if you translate something into different concepts, even because people have different concepts and different languages also have different concepts, then you're really getting something else. It's hard to say that it's something else. It's sort of a translation of that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a translation either. But it's not it's not the light. You don't get they talk about Chabad, they like talking about these differences very much. What it would mean exactly to get something through a translation or another. Really, the Rizal sort of talks about two different kind of things. One is a tzemtzum, one is a parts. In other words, the Matzilas, even the Zav, the Matzilas especially, which he's talking about over here, doesn't get light directly from Abba or from Ein Sof, right? Because Ein Sof goes to Chachma, and Chachma goes to Bina, and Bina goes into Za. And then from Bina, he said the Rizal always calls it a window. what we call the Yesod Ema, is a window from the Zan. We talk about windows, of course, windows in heaven are a biblical image. And Zakim Besalim V'zeh Shara Shamayim. So there's a gate, a door, an opening into heaven, which is the Makam HaMikdash. And that's an image of as if everything is closed off, but we left you one little space, and that's also the image of Tzimtzum that the Arizal generally has. We left you one little space, and through that, the light from the higher level gets to you. So you get a little bit of the same. We can call it, this is not a translation, but a sort of miut. It's not that you're getting it only in translation. You could understand one word of the whole book, right? So if there's a whole book which explains Divrei Chachma, this is a Chabad style mushal, then if you would understand only one chapter, maybe that chapter is the most important one, or the least important one, we could have differences of that, which part or which word, but at least you have one word of it, and you don't have the entirety of it, but you have part of it. Then we could just take the whole book and put it through a translation machine. Then you don't even get anything of it. You get just the entire, maybe even get more, but entirely true translation. Now, the different levels of these chaloines and masachim are really what defines the difference between different olamas and different spheres and olam atzilus, even as the Rizal explains this in great detail. And in any case, so therefore, as long as you're in olam atzilus, of course, olam atzilus is itself some sort of masach, but let's not consider that. Now, what makes olam atzilus and olam abriya distinct worlds as opposed to just different levels is that between the olam atzilus and olam abriya, there is not any space, there's not any hole, there's not any window that you can see from olam atzilus to olam abriya, at least not in a simple way. But what there is a masach, a pereches, a curtain, a real boundary between olam atzilus and olam hayetzira and olam abriya, and everything olam atzilus, olam abriya will be through that masach. It cannot get anything directly from olam atzilus, and that is really what makes olam abriya into a totally different world, right? When we think of the concept of world, what we usually think of is what you can imagine existing, right? So we can have a lot of different levels, like in this world, or a world that, when I say a world, I don't mean literally a world. Rizal does use very simple literal images and talks about there being 4 floors, 4 flights, which are the 4 elements. But that's just for the clarity of the thing. But when I talk, I'm just trying to give a little more concept. When you try to talk about a world, what I really mean is in your world, there could be, for example, if someone grows up in a certain society, so to him, there are, of course, every society has tzaddikim, ben and reshaim. There's no such a thing as a society without different levels, without different hierarchies, without different, at least different levels of people, right? There's good people, there's bad people, there's sort of normal people in between. Okay, so that's your world. So in other words, that world has itself like 10 spheres, like different levels. You could be malchus of this world, you could be more clear about this world, you could be the highest level, you could be the kesser of this world. That's the top. But nobody in this world imagines something that's entirely different, right? So nobody, I don't want to say examples to get people mad. Nobody in the standard Western world, nobody imagines something that's really a tzaddik, right? As an example, there's good people, there might be even inspired people, there might be all kinds of different things. But you need to actually enter into a religious world to even imagine that in your world should even exist something called a real tzaddik, and whatever real tzaddik means. And for us, I don't know what world I'm in, but you could see if you straddle these worlds, you could see that there's a real difference in what people even imagine to be possible for a human being. If you in America, yes, there's better people and worse people, and there's even great people, and actually they even heard of like what we call saints or holy people, but they don't really conceptualize it the way it's conceptualized within a religious world where there's different concepts and different levels. So yeah, maybe it's a good person, maybe someone that dedicates himself to doing good and so on. And if you go into a Chassidish world, for example, then you'll hear about a tzaddik as someone that literally, and this is, of course, maybe it's an exaggeration, maybe this is a what can't call the regulative ideal, maybe it's just something that we hope to get to, but at least it's something that exists in this world. So of course, maybe we're in the malchus of that world, and this is talking about Atik, okay, but at least there's something that exists. And we talk about, if you go in Chassidish stories and Chassidish books, you talk about it's a person that doesn't do any move without an intention, without a yichud, right? That doesn't, and there's literally the things that they say. Now, for this to even exist, it needs to be in a different world. So that's, if I want to go into America and explain them this, I can't, that's not the chat. If I go to a Chassidish person, go to a Chassidish person, I tell them, you know, you maybe some days, maybe on Shabbos, maybe when you're in a good mood, maybe then you could eat with kavanah. You could, for every bite you take, you could have some mechavan Hashem, right? That's kavanah sadisa. So that's your level. If you imagine a tzaddik which does this all week, okay, so that he would be the attic of your world, and you're different. But if I go to America and I start talking about this, it's not, my problem is not that I can't get them to imagine someone that can do it 24 hours a day or 10 hours a day, would be a lot, or 2 hours a day, right? But the problem is that I can't even explain to him what it would mean to eat a piece of pizza and be Mechavan Hashem. He's like, what does that even mean? So I have to translate the whole thing into something else where it loses almost all of its meaning. It might, if I'm a good translator, I might be able to. There's people that work on this, that this their job, to translate really holy things, really Chassidish Mesogim, into the world of America. And I say, well, you could eat, I don't know, mindfully, right? That's the world that's already a mitzvah. It's a chashmal. You could eat mindfully, and yes, that's a translation, but it totally doesn't mean what it means in the Chassidish world. Then we could talk about levels. So you could see very easily that there's something called being in one world. I'm in the same world as, if you're in the Chassidish world, you're in the same world as the Chassidish tzaddikim. Of course, you're not in their level. And then that would be called receiving R through a light, through a little hole, through a little window. So you don't get the whole thing, of course, but you get some of it. You can get Tuf and he gets Aleph. And then there's something called being in a totally different world where everything is through a mechitza. Everything goes through a translation level, and you literally don't have access to any of the actual objects in that world. Again, this is one mushal. We think in a lot of different terms for this. I just want to give some sort of understanding, so we should be able to grasp onto this thing of being a mechitza and being a window. Now, back to where we are. Oh, that was fun. We have to go back to the real part, the technical part. So now this is the Arizal's teaching. So there's a musach, mechitza. This is mafsek ben olam atzilas leolam ha bria. And of course, the same thing between bria and yetzira. It might be there might be some difference, because of course yetzira has some even further. It's not only a quantity of being 3 more. There's actually a difference, which he talks about in Yitzchok over there. But this is the similar. And between a world, there's needs to be a musach. Now the Arizal thinks through his image, and the Arizal thinks everything in the image of a person, right? The parts of. I said, okay, if olam atzilas, and of course we'll get to in the next piece how exactly this means all parts of atzilas. But if olam atzilas in general can be considered one person, right? A adam, then we're thinking of the bottom of it. We're thinking of what stops this person from existing and lets another person, another world start existing. And of course, the lowest thing, or the thing, it's not even the thing, right? The thing that's after the person, that's on the bottom of the person, the lowest thing, place of the person, and is mafstik between him and the next world, or the ground, or the next thing, are his shoes. So Arizal says, when you think of a musach, I have a way of thinking of it, which is the shoe. So the shoe of olam atzilas is this musach, this paroiches, which is mafsik ben olam atzilas olam bria. That's the shoe of olam atzilas. And really what he wants to say is that when you put on your shoes, which just is what he's been saying the whole time, when you put on your shoes, really what you're doing is embodying, if you are the Matzilis or whichever parts of Matzilis you are, maybe we'll get to talk about these differences in a minute. If you're the Matzilis, then your shoes are the Mechitza, which is Mafsek, which creates the boundary between Olam Matzilis and Olam Abriya. Okay, so that's the first thing we know. Now, we need to, of course, go into this more. We need to understand 2 important things, which, again, these things are already in the Remak in some ways, but that is a lot more clear and deliberate about these things. Just that when I say there's a Masach, so what I say is 2 things. Number 1, I have to understand that this is Masach is not only on the last level of Olam Atzilis. So we could say the Nalef, right? The language of Shira how beautiful are your steps in your shoes, right? So that's talking about the Shechina. And there's of course beautiful shoes which sort of keep us from getting to what's beyond the shoes, right? We have to figure out how to go through that. And if you read that song, you see that it goes up and talks about and Rashi already says that we're trying to ascend. The shoes is just where we start. But for the Arizal, that's not enough, because he doesn't want anything to be separate from anything else. Something that's going on. And to him, when I say it's the shoe, I don't want it to say it's the shoe of the Malchus, because then it would just be the shoe of the Nuk, which might be a correct way of talking about things, but it's not only that. These shoes are really the shoes of the Nuk and the Za and Abiv Ima and Aricham bin Adatik. So he says like this, Kfaidat, you already know. He actually said it a moment ago over here. And of course, if you read that Chaim, you already know it. But again, we're learning things here. So of course, one of the big things that Rizal taught, that Rizal literally taught that this is a difference in Ulama Shvira and Ulama Tikkun, and it's also a difference in that Rizal's way of reading Kabbalah and any other ways. So it's a good example of that, and I made a picture of it just so we could see it. And the Rizal's image is that we don't have Zel Malim, what the Rizal calls Zel Malim is that. So you should not imagine, you should not think of Ulama Tzilas. And of course, this is not only a picture, but this is the diagram that we look at it. We don't only imagine the Atik being on top and Arich lower and Chacham a little lower and so on, but we imagine them as being Zalifnim is one inside the other, like a Russian doll, right? Or in earlier Kabbalah, they didn't have Russian dolls, they said like an onion, right? And this, so if you look at a cross section of Al Matzilas, now there's differences at the top, which is what the Rizal teaches, that the reason why we say that Atik is higher than Arich is really because at the top of Atik, there is no Arich. So if you would look, not in a cross section, you would look directly facing Atilis, you would see on the top Arich and Atik and later Arich. And then Abavim and then Zoom. So it's actually a beautiful way of understanding what's going on. That says, yes, when you're looking at that Atilis from the outside, what you would see is on the top Keser and then Chachma and so on. But I could look from the inside. I can give you a cross section of it. And if you know the actual cross section of it, you know that really Atik goes down until the bottom. And Arich also, and Abavim also, although Abavim is a little more complicated, but we're not getting into that. And Zon also. So in other words, that Rizal has this image of that Tzilis, like I showed you here, as they all finish in the same place. So the floor of Olam Atzilis, so to speak, the feet of Olam Atzilis, all of the feet are in the same place. So therefore, if you want to talk about a shoe for Olam Atzilis, you really need to talk about, I'm not sure if it's really the image that maybe we should mention a little bit different, but it seems like you're thinking of something like this. So if you're thinking about the shoe of Olam Atzilis, you think of a shoe which is under Atik and Arich and Abavim and Zon, because their feet are all at the same place, and all of these, and then further down would be Olam Abri. So this is the shoe that goes not only on the Zon, it actually goes at least because in the Zon is Atik, is Abavim, and in that is Arich and so on. So it's really going, it's different, and these feet are actually finishing all on the same level. So that's the Nal. In other words, when you put on your shoes, you're not only putting on the shoes of the Nuk, you're also putting on the shoes of Abavim and also of Atik and also of Arich. I'm going in the wrong order. But anyways, the shoes of every level of Al-Matzilah, since your shoes need to cover. In other words, what we're talking about here, this is what he's really interested in. He's not interested in the Nalayim of the Nuk, you already talked about it earlier, but he's interested in the Nalayim of the Al-Matzilah. In other words, what makes the Al-Matzilah, what stops the Al-Matzilah and creates that what's after that is Al-Mabriyah. So we have to talk about the entire Al-Matzilah. Of course, Al-Matzilah also has Atik and Arich and Abavim and Zon. So we have to talk about all of them and explain why this one shoe would be enough for all of them, because and this one shoe is under those feet, and this is what is the itself the masach that's mafsig between Atzilas and Bria. So that's one added distinction that there is added, that you shouldn't think of the shoe as being only on the Malchus, it's really on all of the Pratzifim. But now we have to go in the other direction and understand that when we talk about a masach, we don't only talk about it as a mafsik, it's really also a mavir, right? It's not only a boundary, it's actually also a filter. But this filter is not only there to stop things, it's actually there, like I said earlier, to translate the Matzilis into El Mamriya, right? So when you put on your shoes, we have to think of not only of stopping your body or your light, have from, like we said, being protected, and not only in the bad way. We talk this here over here. I'm not going to make things complicated. Also talking about translating and giving over the light that you have into everything else. This is a very important, of course, going back to what the Ramak said, that we have to understand. This is going to talk about that when we talk about 10 spheres of Olam Abriya, we're really talking about a carbon copy, and they have a different language, but a carbon copy of the same of Olam Atzil. So it might be different matter, it might be a different Olam in some way, but it's also the same Olam in another way. In other words, it's also the same spheres, like the Ramak said. Otherwise, we would end up with too many spheres, and that's wrong. That's disallowed. Disallowed to have more than 10 spheres in Kabbalah. So the Ramak explained on this based on the Tikkun Azar that the Olam Abriya and by Briya Tzili is called the Choisam of Olam Atzilis. What he means by that is that imagine you have a stamp, right? And you have it has pieces that stick out, right? It's engraved in a way that you stick it into ink, and then they don't think of one in ink, they think of one in like clay or what do you call it? Like Play-Doh, no? You put the stamp into the clay, and then you end up with an image on the clay, and that image is not the stamp, right? It's something that was printed from the stamp, something that was an image of the stamp. And this is actually a very old image in philosophy. I'm not going to get into the stories of that. Very old image of describing how the same thing can go into another thing in some way. And the Mekabbalim at least use this image to explain the difference to Olam Atzilis, that Olam Atzilis is the actual stamp, the actual piece of wood or piece of metal that you're using. Then, so the real actual tense is Olam Briya is like when you put that and you stamp it into clay, that's the Olam Ha-Briya. And then we could talk about Olam Atzilis being a stamp of that or different levels in the stamp. That's different, more differences that we can get to if we read Sharabiya, both in its Chaim and in Pardes. The important thing for us is that now, according to this, we have to understand that when we talk about the Musach, the thing that stops Olam Atzilis, right? It says Ad kan Olam Atzilis Mekam ve'elach, right? Mekam ve'elach Olam Abriya. That thing is also the translation layer, which creates this stamp, this enstamping of Olam Atzilis and Olam Abriya. In other words, when you put on your shoes, you're not just stopping the light from going further, and therefore creating the boundary, the gvul of Olam Atzilis, and not just protecting from the klippas, which is somehow connected to this whole thing, but we're not going to get into how it's sort of connected because it seems to be contradictory. But you're also actually enstamping the Olam Abriya from that, right? So in other words, if we want to talk about Derech Avoda, which is what we like to talk about, is it's very important to not have boundaries that totally disconnect. There's actually no such boundary apparently in Kabbalah. In other words, every time like we have this whole story, which I always think of, Mesachtas Brachos, which with there's a shomer in the Beis Medrash. They put a gate, they put a guard in front of his Medrash, Gamliel, put a guard and said, whoever is not worthy of learning should not come in. And then Elizabeth Azari disagreed and he took away the guard. In any case, it's still true that the Torah needs a guard. There needs to be some sort of boundary, which otherwise, like we said, otherwise it becomes clippers. Otherwise, you become, you start believing, really, and this connects very much to what I was saying about the different worlds. Otherwise, you become part of America, and then it's very hard to even sustain what you're doing if it doesn't exist at all in that world. So in order for a greater world to exist, there needs to be something, some kind of gate that makes that world into another world. But whenever we do that, we never want to actually deny the outside from everything. What we really want to do, and this is what Arizal generally wants to do, is to deny the outside to receive it in a way in which he would not be able to accept it. In other words, it would be worse, actually, if we would just say the truth to anyone in the street. We would not be helping the street. It would be actually making him further away from the truth because it's spoken in a language which he doesn't understand and it's just turning him off. So what we always need to do is that this Musach is actually also has the power. And since we're thinking of Kavuna, I don't know what exactly the Kavuna is. I sort of giving you the idea to translate what happens in the Matzilis into Olam Abriya. So whenever you set up some gate, some kind of little group which says this is going to be our circle and we're going to protect ourselves, we're going to allow ourselves to do things that are more true to us inside this circle, you have to make sure that the wall that you set up around you has the capacity of also then translating it to others. It's not a really hermetic wall. It's not a totally closed wall. It's a wall that is actually what causes the translation to be able to happen. I think the real way this happens is with having different circles of people. You could call them students or call them partners, which each will take it and receive things. And if you see a good Rebbe somewhere, that's really what happens. Then they translate it further. So they serve both as a boundary, so you don't get burnt by the Rebbe's light, and they serve as a translation layer for the people that and therefore can get closer and eventually maybe be that. But that's like we learn Ilma Bria, and eventually it could become Ilma Tzilis. But that's again getting us into more complex territory. So this is what we're reading over here in as Gimel, like separated in the Derech Zeh HaMusach Me'ir Na Partzifum Da Tzilis Lamata Bria. כי יוצא עוד דרך רגלי עתק ואיפה דרך רגלי ארך עד שמגיעים רגלי זום ועוברים מהרוסים דרך המסך. So through this masach, it's not only what stops the Matzilis from bumping into Ilma, but it's what gives over the light. And which light? Like we learned in the second thing, not only the light of the Nuk, but the light from Atik, which can through Arich, which can through Avim, which can through Zon, all of them through Ilma Bria and Validezeh. And we learn as that. That's how in Ilma Bria there's also 10 spheres. So therefore, that's how we could have in Olam Atzilis. There's Atik de Bria, there's Arich de Bria. In other words, when you're the translator, when you're the Gabbai that stands to do the translates things for the people that don't understand, you're not going to want to translate only the last thing, like only the Halacha Lamasa. So therefore, you should go out and you're going to want to translate everything from the first level, from Keser, from the highest thing that the Rebbe taught. Of course, that itself will go through all the level translation layers in order to make sense to someone in a different world. But you can't just translate the last thing. If you just translate the last thing, which what happened, like if you have the Torah itself, people say, okay, I'm going to teach someone entirely outside. Well, I'm just going to teach you how to tie your shoes, right? We've been learning about halacha lamasa. You say, okay, halacha is the shechina, halacha is the malchus, halacha is the nuk, it's the halacha lamasa. That's all you need. But that's not true, because in the nuk there needs to be feeling, which is and in that there needs to be thought, which is bin, and in that there needs to be dvaikas, which is chachma, and in that there needs to be bittul, which is keser, or however you want to call it. In other words, really, if you teach some person that's starting from zero which way to tie your shoes, you really need to make sure to teach them also how the shoes are the zone, which are getting the protection of Imma and everything that we're learning here. Otherwise, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. And how exactly this works, again, something like I described. Now, the Bria Nekram Choisam Shlas Rizatils Minutes Line Mishasham Spheres. I wrote it where you should look if you want to look it up more clearly. These 10 spheres, the Ilma Bria, they're the Choisam, they're the stamp of, I don't know if stamp is the correct word. It's the part that gets stamped, right? That's what he means. Doesn't mean the stamp, he means the ink, or not the ink. Again, think of like clay. The clay that gets a insignia like of the Ilma Bria Atzilis. And then he says again, like mamash. So this is important. The oider raglaim literally derech hamusach. That's of course the closest level. So you get literally the light of the feet. So in other words, in some sense, we could talk about all the next elements as being the feet, like Chazal has language. Right? You should sit at the feet of the teachers of the smart people. That's because you're going to get literally the light of the feet, but in their feet, so I think what he's saying here when he talks about of course, in Yitzchok, there's an elaboration of the differences between these things. What he means to say is that I just gave you the concept of a shoe, and shoe as the musach, shoe as the musach, which both receives from Atik up until there, and therefore gives it all over to the next level. Now, of course, this is a general concept. There's a musach between Olam Hatzilis and Olam HaBria. There's also a musach between Olam HaBria and Olam HaYetzira. There's also a between Olam HaYetzira and Olam HaSiyah. So therefore, maybe if you're in Olam HaBria, then your shoes will be the musach of Olam HaBria. Maybe if you're in Olam HaYetzira, in other words, just because you're in a different Olam doesn't mean that you don't have the same structure, doesn't mean you have the same patterns that we have. We talk, Darizal generally likes talking about Olam HaTzilis, but the same thing is true for Olam HaBria. So maybe if you're wake up in a bad mood one day and you don't want to be mechavan about how your shoes are the musach of Olam HaTzilis, you could be mechavan of the Olam HaBria or the Olam HaYetzira, and maybe even the Olam HaSiyah actually seems to have some sort of musach. And again, you could read over there to see exactly how. Okay, so this is Atkan is the basic understanding of this shoe. If you're got up to here, then you should be happy, and you know the covenant. Now, there's one more thing which really ties this back into the earlier discussion of Chashmal being the Chashmal of Imam. And there's one line over here, and actually, if you read Netz Chaim, you'll understand exactly what he means. I'll try to just explain this line in simple terms, just so we could read it. So he says like this vanillin is datis. This is Reb Chaim speaking. Actually, in different places, he seems to say this in the name of Darizal. So it's a good question. What happened? So the Tikkun Zohar, which is really more or less the source of this whole idea of the four worlds, says a lot of things about them. Of course, he has this basic understanding, the basic ontology of them, which is that they're like chesamas, they're the engravings or the stamps of the upper worlds and all of the levels of that. He also says something which divides the four worlds in the way of the four main spheres, or what Arizal would call the four main partzufim, right? Of course, Arizal has a fifth world, which is Ak, which would correspond to the fifth sphere or Atik. And the Tikkunim says, Abba, at least that's, we understand that there's some differences in the details, but that's in the basic way. There is this four worlds. The four worlds are like the four Isis of the Shemavaya. Abba would be, or Chachma or the Yud would be the Olam Atzilis. Bina or Imma or the He of the Shemavaya would be in the Olam Abriya. So that's the language of the Tukkim is Imma Mekanna B'Kasai. The Imma, the Bina, has her home. Mekanna is like, again, we're thinking earlier of the bird. She has her nest. She nests in Olam Abriya. So if you want to translate, like Danimat likes translating the imagery. Imma, the supernal mother, nests in the Olam Abriya. Right? That's how you translate Imelo Makana B'Kersaya. Well, actually, Kersaya means in the throne, which is the Zohar code for Olam Abriya, because that's the Olam HaKisya covered. So if the Olam Atzilis is the man, is the Odam HaKisya, the Kisya is the Olam Abriya. Right? And then moving on from that, the Teferes or the Zah is the Vav, is the Olam HaYetzira, and the Malchus or the Nuk or the He'achrona of the Shemavaya is in the Olam HaAsiyah. Now, the Arizal seems to have been very worried about what this actually means. Of course, the basic sense of it is just this, that we can always divide everything by this way. The Arizal is never really happy with that. Of course, it's true. We talk about the Shemavai, we can talk about it like we discuss. There should be a class like with these basics. Maybe I'll make one. We can discuss everything pratim. And so we can discuss in the most general klal as the four olamas, being the four oisis of the Shem. We can discuss this in one olam, the 10 spheres, from each sphere we could divide again. So of course that's just an easy that everyone knows. But Arizal generally think that there's always depth beyond that. Although that's true, that's not enough for the Zohar to tell us these things, because like we know that already. So why does I have to tell it to us again? So in the Arizal, if you read that Chaim, there's different direction. There seems to be four different readings that he has of this statement of the Tikkun Zohar, that Imma is in the Abriya and so on. And here the Chaim Tal is giving one of the reasons. And what he's really saying is something like this. What would it mean for the Olam Abriya to be the world of Imma? Yes, of course, it's true that if you look at the levels and you divide the levels and the like Erech, and you can't, it turns out that that's useless. So what he really wants to get at is talk about going back to what really makes every olam, like we said in the beginning, what really makes every olam a different olam? What really makes every olam, or really every level in the world, a different level, is how pure, right? The level of purity, the level of openness of the light that it gets, right? Or how many mesachim and mavdilim it went through, right? So, of course, what makes olam atzilis is that it gets light through chachma directly, and what makes olam abriya is that it doesn't get the light directly; it only gets it through this nal or this musach. Now recall that what we learned earlier, that this nal is really chashmal. And chashmal is really the outer shell or the outer garment, or maybe the outer skin. So questions of how exactly to read it, of the Imma Eloah, which encompasses the zon in her, and that's what turns into the nal. Therefore, we understand that, and this is this is the layer that separates El Matzitz from El Mabriya. So now you understand that everything Olam Abriya gets, of course, Olam Abriya itself has Atik Arich. It's all translated in the way of Imma. So all the light that Olam Abriya gets is from this Chashmal of Imma. And therefore, we could talk about Imma Eloah Mekana B'Gesay. And therefore, in a similar way, he says that when we say that is the Olam HaYetzira, the Olam HaTeferes, it's because the Musach that separates Olam HaBriya from Olam HaYetzira is created not from the Imma Eloah, like the Olam HaTzilis, it's created from the Zah of Olam HaBriya somehow. In the same way, when we say that Malchus is in Olam HaAsiyah, what we mean is that the Malchus of Briya is the translation layer that gives us everything, all the light and everything. So that's why everything that Olam Briya, the Olam HaTzilis. So this is the Chaim Tal Arizal's explanation of Imma Mekana V'Kersai, because going back to this Chashmal, which is the Chashmal of Imma, which is what is the Parayich, what is the Masach between the Olam HaTzilis and the Olam Briya, and therefore all the light the Olam Briya gets is through the language and through the Masach of Imma Eloah of Atzilis, right? Which goes through, which although it's really higher, but we learned earlier that it also covers up the zone of Atzilus and from there to Elam Abriya. So now we've finished all of the kavanas of wearing your shoes. Hopefully we'll have a different experience in putting in our shoes now that we have this class. Next time, what are we gonna do? What I'm planning to do, I'm sort of aiming. There's really, if you go on the Seder of Shar Kavanas, we sort of started in the beginning. And after this comes something called Inyan Abrachas, which talks about, it's known in the Shash world as Matpeh Abracha. It's about the Kavanah of it's not working.